We are in a late model JK that we're going to do an LT1 8-speed swap in, and this is not a 3.6 Pentastar, it's an LS7, or allegedly an LS7. And I want to use this Jeep to talk about the big cammed engines. Now, this Jeep has several strikes against it. One, it's got this big cam. Watch what happens when I put it in neutral. It's idling over 1,000 RPM. The idle is fluctuating. This is not pleasurable at all. We also have no air conditioning. I don't know if that's related to the idle or not. Probably not. This Jeep does have a stock radiator in it. It's also got this 5-speed transmission, which just makes no sense at all. It's just revving the motor up. I feel like a clown going down the street. But getting back to the cam, when this vehicle gets its LT1, it's going to be more powerful than this. You're going to pull into a drive-through, and it's going to tick over at 450 to 500 RPM. You're going to be able to talk to the guy next to you. At Motec, we've done quite a few cammed engines, and we're just starting to shy away from them. And I know the company that built this Jeep is also. The problem is you just reduce the drivability of the vehicle. The vehicle gets obnoxious. It's hard to control the idle when you're off-road. Yeah, now if you're the kind of guy that uses the skinny pedal as a switch, it's on or off, the cam might work. But the reality is, if you have an option to get an engine that's got more power, that has better drivability, gets better gas economy, and I'm not really sure, they did some clever stuff on this Jeep. I've got to look at this more carefully. I think this is a 14 or 15 Jeep, but it's been retrofitted back to an NGC4, so that's the early 3.8 computer. They're not running the Pentastar computer, and I'm not really sure how they're mating that with a NAGS 1 controller. I'll take a look at it and figure it out, but the reality is we don't want to run the NAGS 1 controller because we don't want to run that transmission. The WA580 is definitely a better transmission than the JK 4-speed, but it's nowhere on the same level as a 6, 8, or 10-speed GM. So coming to a stop here, I've really got to push on the brake, which is kind of annoying. Watch what happens if I let the brake off. The Jeep just takes off. So we're going to put it in neutral, and then putting it in neutral gets us back to that idle oscillation, which is really annoying. This Jeep does have a stock radiator. It's finally cool in Vegas. It rained, but we're still running higher temps because it's got a stock radiator with the stock JK fan. So what's our goal for this Jeep? Our goal is to put an LT1 in, which is going to be much more docile, more powerful. It's going to have a much better transmission. I'm pretty sure this guy's getting the 8-speed, not the 10-speed. And to just get rid of all the annoying habits that makes this Jeep not fun to drive. Just sitting here in an idle watching this this idle oscillation drives me nuts because I'm a very mechanically minded guy, and I just don't like stuff like that. And then the transmission having some-timers. I call it some-timers because these transmissions, you can rev them up and they don't shift, and then sometimes they short shift, and they just do weird things. They don't shift when you think it needs to shift. And Motec over the last decade has actually taken many. We got some shudder there too. Motec has taken many WA580 Jeeps and switched them over to 6 speeds. So whether that came with the LS3, or we actually did a couple with the Hemis. And you see, this thing is just a light throttle. It's not shifting even at close to 3,000 RPM, and that's kind of crazy. An LT is going to be, shifting at 1,200 RPM. The thing about the LT though is, and that's what I kept trying to hammer home in my previous videos, is you're going to have more power than an engine like this, and you're not going to have to put up with any of these nuisances. You don't have to put up with this loud, obnoxious engine. Now, I can't blame the builder for the way the engine runs, because that's just what it is. It's a cammed engine with an automatic transmission. And while you can make improvements to it, it's just never going to be the same as a mildly cammed engine. Now, the LT1 that we're going to install in this vehicle has continuous variable valve timing. So it's going to have, this LT1 is going to have more compression. It's going to have 11.5 to 1 compression with continuous variable valve timing and direct injection. So what it's going to end up doing is outperforming this engine without any of the downsides. I put this video out so that we can do kind of a before and after compare, how the transmission shifts and what it sounds like and how radical it is and all that. Let's see if we can order a burrito in this drive-through with this LS7 cammed engine. Can you hear me?
No.
All right, hang on. Another good and bad about this engine is the fan is running all the time. But the good news is the engine's so loud you can't hear it. And guys, I used to deal with this back in the day. Actually, it was worse without fuel injection. But you could go through a yuppie parking lot and set alarms off, or you have the birdies run away from you. The beauty of the LT is that you don't got to deal with any of that. It's so quiet and refined and smooth. So I'm using this Jeep to display my experience with cammed engines and why I try to shy you guys away from these cammed engines. There is a place for cams. If you can take a little 5.3, you put a mild RV cam in it, yeah, you can pick up 20-30 horsepower. But again, I say buy the horsepower that you want. This morning we're in a late model JK with a LT1 10-speed. And it's an awesome combination, as you know. But where do I start with this Jeep? Because this Jeep has been completely transformed. This Jeep had a 5-speed, the W580, but it also had an LS7 in it when we received it. It didn't have the 3.6. This Jeep is a good example of how different approaches are taken to get a V8 into a JK, especially a GM. Now, I couldn't call this completely a GM powertrain because it was a hybrid. It was running a W580, which was really a big part of the customer's complaint. The W580 is not as good of a transmission, in my opinion, at least far from it, as even a 6L80. But now we've gone to a 10-speed, so we've got, instead of 5 forward gears, we got 10 forward gears. The LS7, as you know, is a high-performance LS engine that's been punched out and has got a cam. The LS7 is rated over 500 horsepower, normally aspirated. So it's a pretty radical engine to start. And you combine that with a 5-speed, and this thing was like, it was like Malibu Grand Prix. We got short gears in it. It felt really zippy in the short run, but it didn't really have long legs. Cruising on the freeway at high speeds was not very pleasant. I did drive it prior to the swap, and that 5-speed just drove me nuts. And when you combine it with an engine that's pretty radical, now from what I understand, the way they did it was they changed the camshaft out, and the LS7 has a pretty radical camshaft, but they're not changing it to make the camshaft more radical. They're changing it to change the firing order so that the firing order is compatible with the Hemi firing order, and that way they can run it using a Chrysler controller. And this is all weird to me, to us, because as you all know, we like to run pure GM operating systems. This vehicle now has stock GM computers, stock GM harness, calibrations, operating systems. It's all pure GM, front to rear. This Jeep ran, but the drivability compared to this LT1 is night and day. It's black and white. This is like an extremely mild engine that anybody would drive pretty much anywhere, but it's still tremendously powerful. Now, the other engine was powerful, and in the short run, like I said, it ran hard. You can't compare the drivability between these two engines. One was an engine that made you feel like you were at a Malibu Grand Prix track, and this engine, you could drive 1,000 miles in comfort. Now, when I drove this with the LS7 and the 5-speed, it was just so Ricky Racer that I told the customer, you got to up gear this thing up. And really, it could use to be geared up. But the difference is this LT sucks it up. Instead of having 5 forward gears, you got 10 forward gears. Instead of having an engine that's idling at 1,100 RPM or 1,000 RPM, whatever it was, you got an engine ticking over at 450 RPM. And don't think this LT1 is a slouch. This LT1 is very powerful, especially when you put it in with a 10-speed. It's just so docile, then you get into it just a little. That's just a little bit of throttle, and it moves this JK like nothing. Now, the LS7 would do the same thing, but it would do it in a completely different way, and that's hard to quantify. So let's talk about the different approaches. All the way back in 2008, when Motec started doing these conversions, we wanted to stay all GM. Engine, transmission, harnesses, modules, computers. So much advantage to GM powertrains. You can buy HP tuners and tune it. You can take it to a dealer and have it diagnosed. You can hook a scanner up, diagnose it yourself. Wire colors, operating systems, calibrations, all stock GM. Now, we did explore the option of running the LS inside of the Chrysler operating system, but the problem is we didn't want to run the Chrysler operating system. They're hard to tune, they're more expensive to work on, and now you're taking an engine and basically modifying it mechanically and electronically to make it think it's a Hemi. And then you know, I'm not saying it doesn't work. You do get some of the advantages. You know, you get the lighter weight of the LS and all that, but it's just a different philosophy than ours. Our philosophy is keep it all GM. The calibrations aren't locked down. Now, do we recommend you tune it? No, not really. We run stock GM calibrations, and they run great. And while they're not maximized for performance, they're not maximized for economy, they're not maximized for any one thing, they're maximized for everything. And that's what GM has to do. These things have to operate on a daily basis for hundreds of thousands of miles. They have to operate in the hot, they have to operate in the cold, they have to operate if some teenage Ricky Racer's driving it versus grandma, and they do a very good job at that. Now, if you want to get a little bit more economy, you can do an economy tune. You want to get a little bit more power, you can do a performance tune. It's all available to you. You're not slave to any lockdown hybrid calibration. Mechanically, it's all GM. There's no adapters. You guys probably know that there's adapter plates and things to get the Chrysler transmission onto the GM engine. We don't do any of that. It's all pure GM. We do run an adapter that reclocks the transfer case if you're going to run your stock Jeep transfer case, because even though it has a similar pattern, they just clocked it differently. So even like the advanced adapters, Atlas, they used to offer the two different cases. Now they just offer the one and then reclock the adapter. What we've done is we've taken a pure GM powertrain, engine, transmission, ECM, TCM, modules, just everything is pure GM. We let it run the way it's intended to by the manufacturer. Then we run a small bidirectional bridge. It's just one extra module on the network, and with a single module, it's not even an extra one, and it allows the powertrain computers to integrate into the Jeep computer, just like the Jeep controllers integrate into the Jeep system. The benefit of this is we're not modifying the Chrysler side at all. So you can plug into it and service your wireless module, your TIPM, and everything else exactly the way you did before it. You can update it, you can diagnose it. The GM side's the same thing. You can plug into that with factory software and diagnose the engine just like you would before. So what we wanted to make available to you was all the benefits of having a pure powertrain from GM. And I know years ago I said this, but it's making more and more sense now, because when you look at things like emissions compliance, you're not going to get a hybrid certified by the US EPA. But if you have a US EPA certified powertrain with US EPA certified modules and harness and everything else, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier to get that through emissions than it is a hybrid. So what we had with this Jeep was something between a Hemi swap and an LS swap. Because Hemi swaps, again, you're taking basically the powertrain control module and the TCM, and you're trying to make it run a V8 where it used to run a V6. Now that can be done very well, and it is done very well. As far as emission compliance goes, it just depends on how it's done, and some manufacturers do a really good job with it and some don't. So we don't like to hack or patch operating systems and make a V6 computer think it's running a V8. We don't like to hybrid the engine and modify mechanically and electronically things to make it think it's something it's not. We take a pure GM powertrain and stick it in there. We let it run the way it's supposed to run. Then we use this bridge for bidirectional communication, so the things that need to go between the powertrain and the vehicle, like engine RPM and cruise control functions and things like that, are all done over the CAN network. The end result is you get an engine that's running exactly the way it was intended by the manufacturer. I can't tell you how good these LT1s run. I'm excited for this customer to drive his Jeep, because he's going to feel like he's going from a quarter-mile dirt track JK to something that is sophisticated and docile and fun to drive, and not just fun to drive for 5 minutes, fun to drive. I could take this thing to Salt Lake and back, put 1,000 miles on it, and I wouldn't even be fatigued. It's that good. I do believe I took some videos when the vehicle first came in. I'll see if I can get some of that up just to show you a comparison. So often I'll get a customer call and say, hey, I want to do an LS swap or an LT swap, but I want to keep my Chrysler transmission. And we don't support them. We think the 4- and 5-speed Chrysler transmissions aren't even up to the standard of the 6L80. In fact, they're well below the 6L80, and that doesn't even scratch the surface with the 8 or the 10-speed. Now, I will say the new Chrysler 8-speeds are really good. Now, I don't think they're as good as the GM transmissions, and the GM high-gear transmissions had problems in the early days. But they really woke up the Pentastar. And a Hemi with an 8-speed, I think, is a big benefit. Just like an LT1 with an 8 or a 10-speed has a lot of benefits. But it's not just that. When you start looking at the LTs, what we're talking about is an engine that's over 11-to-1 compression. The LT1 is 11.5-to-1 compression. Think about that. When I was growing up, an 11.5-to-1 engine was a radical muscle car engine with a solid lifter cam. And now we've got it in Grandma's Cadillac. What the high compression does is it offers potential energy. Because the more energy the cylinders can put out, the more power you can put out. So what the LT has done is they've harnessed this energy. They've used continuous variable valve timing and direct injection and other technologies to harness the power of a muscle car engine and tone it down to the drivability of a stock 3.6. It really is an awesome vehicle to drive, and I think you would just have to drive one to experience what I'm talking about. A few years back when we started doing the L86s, we ran them against the LS3s and the Hemis, and what we noticed was the L86 was very, very mild, and because of the bottom end torque, it would get a couple of car lengths on the high horsepower Hemis and LSs. Now remember, the L86 was only rated at about if I'm right, about 430 horsepower, 425. But we were running them against the 480 and the 500 horse Hemis and LSs. And in the quarter mile, it was a horse race. So we have two completely different philosophies. A hybrid, which is stick an engine into an existing operating system and make the modifications required to make it work, versus getting a complete powertrain from a manufacturer and installing it the way it was intended to run. Now, that's the way we chose to go. That doesn't mean you can't go other ways. It doesn't mean you can't get a hybrid. It doesn't mean you can't get a Hemi. Of course you can. And everything has its advantage and disadvantage. But I feel that the drivability of these engines, the fact that they are much more emissions compliant, the fact that servicing these, and here, I want to say something. I've been looking at some of these harnesses that have been coming in from other companies, and I got one in the shop right now, and it's a full-on LS3 build. It's got 2 fuses protecting the entire powertrain. 2. A lot of them only have 3. And to me, that's nuts, because I think we got 12, 13, I don't know. But whatever GM runs, we run all those circuits. We run all the power circuits, we run all the ground circuits. Because remember, ground distribution is extremely important. If you were to, let's say, have a coil short out or an injector short out, you got 2 fuses, you're pretty much screwed. Yeah, you could probably figure out which injector is shorted and get out and unplug it, whatever. But when you have the backup and security of the factory failure modes, those extra wires and fuses aren't there for no reason. Copper is very expensive, and manufacturers don't just add wires because they don't have to. We want separate circuits for coils and injectors and knock sensors and whatever, so that the engine can run in failure modes. And we run the full GM harness. It's not quite as pretty. It's not as clean, a lot of people would say, but what you have is all the redundancy built into a factory operating system. So in our world, there really is no right and there is no wrong way to do things. You choose what path you want to go down. You might choose a supercharger because of the cost. You might go with a Hemi because you think it integrates better. You might go with a hybrid. We just chose to go with pure GM powertrains. And I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of advantages to that. Let's start this LT1 up just to show you how mild it is. By the way, this is our new Aeroforce gauge. You can see it's got our logo on it. We actually have some custom software in this from Aeroforce to help support the LS and the LT engines a little bit better. Now, one thing you're going to notice is we have one touch start. So I just basically touch the key and it cranks until it starts, and then it shuts the starter off, so there's no anti-grind. I have noticed that some of the other companies don't do that. They'll like modify the tip-em so it's a manual transmission tip-em, and you have to hold the key until it starts. But anyway, you can see how mild this engine is. Even after start, we're here at 500 RPM. Now, before we would have been at 900, 1,000, I don't know what it was, but it was rump, rump, rump. The whole vehicle was shaking and, you know, all that stuff. Now, if we put this vehicle in gear, and we do have the standard bump shifter. So right now I brought it back into the manual gate, and you can see we can manually shift it, but we're just going to go back up into drive. And at 500 RPM, let's see. Okay, so that's how fast we're going with the brake off. Now with the cammed engine, I probably could get 20 miles an hour out of this thing just by letting the brake off. So it's a tremendous difference, and I think this customer is really going to enjoy the improvement in drivability over the last engine. As I mentioned earlier, one of this customer's biggest complaints was the transmission. Now the 10-speed is awesome. It's a very versatile transmission. It has a very low first gear. I think it's 4.6, and it has a very high tall gear. I think it's 0.60. So we have much more diverse gearing than the 5-speed. We've got twice as many forward gears. So we can pretty much be at any speed at any RPM, and we're going to have good throttle response. We're not going to have to depend on that cammed engine to wind up or get into its power band. So don't forget that the transmissions are a big part of these conversions. These 8 and 10 speeds really can take even the small 5.3 and wake them up and make them feel more responsive. And then you combine it with the high compression and all that, and it feels, it's kind of more like driving a Ford diesel truck or a Duramax. Now it's not a Duramax, of course, but I'm just saying, instead of a pure gas motor like the old LS or the Hemi, you're kind of halfway to that diesel-like drivability, because we got 40-inch tires and armor and all this other weight hanging off of our Jeep, and having that diesel-like torque is awesome. Now that's just light throttle, guys, and it sounds like a Corvette. But this thing is a puppy dog. You're idling it through a drive-through, and it doesn't attract any attention at all. You're that guy with that rump and a rump. You're going through a drive-through. Everybody knows you got something. This is kind of like concealed carry. You know, if you're out there open carrying, everybody knows what you got. You're playing your cards. You're showing your cards. But with an LT1, it blends in. It might have a little bit of rumble to it, but nothing that's going to attract a lot of attention. But it's also going to perform. It's going to perform right up there, those 450 to 500 horsepower engines, and it's not going to let you down. So to me, it's the best of both worlds. So you don't have to look like some clown idling through a supermarket parking lot, setting alarms off. In fact, I've done that in my earlier days. You can be putting around like Grandpa Joe, but when it comes to putting down the power, you're not going to be lacking anything. We're going to take this vehicle up to the mountain, and we'll see you guys here shortly.